I've actually just sat down to watch some footage of Mark De Mori. We've talked about David Haye versus Mark De Mori on this channel quite a bit in terms of David Haye's side of things, and quite a bit in terms of the broadcaster. Will it be broadcast on YouTube? We now know it's going to be broadcast on Dave, bizarrely, etc. But what we haven't yet talked about on the channel was my impressions of Mark De Mori and how decent a fighter, how decent an opponent he is. To be frank, that was largely because he's someone who I haven't actually seen box too much in the past. I'm aware of his name following heavyweight boxing, but I haven't actually devoted much time to watching him and to seeing him fight. Now, I've actually looked the guy up. Now, first let's talk about his BoxRec. He's got a relatively anonymous BoxRec profile. The biggest name on his resume, bizarrely, was when he fought Alex Leopai, who at the time was debuting. And that was a draw. He hasn't actually fought real big names of note, De Mori. There's no one on his resume who, at the time, you could say was a top 50 fighter when Mark De Mori beat him. So he's largely anonymous from that sense. And that's why his BoxRec ranking is so low. I think BoxRec have him outside of the top 100 in the heavyweight division. Whilst I accept he probably is outside the top 100 based on level of opposition he's fought, having watched him, he actually isn't quite as bad as I think some people are making out, because there are a lot of thoughts out there that this guy is going to be blown out in a few seconds by David Haye, and this guy doesn't deserve to be in the same ring as David Haye, even though David Haye hasn't fought anyone for 3.5 years or so. So I've had a look at the guy. Now, the first thing to say is you are struck by the fact that he is quite plodding and his footwork is unexceptional. He's not got foot speed, he's not got class movement, and against a guy who at his prime was so athletic, so dynamic, and such a good mover as David Haye, you'd have to say that would be a concern. Now, I'm addressing the negatives first. I always like to give both sides. But if we take out the sort of plodding, heavy, slow-footedness, which I agree at sort of world-class boxing is quite a big thing just to ignore. But if we put that aside to 1 second, there are actually quite a few pros to Mark De Mori from what I've seen of him. And granted, these are pros that I've seen of him at a relatively low level that he's been fighting at. Let me say, the guy is not an entirely different operator to Derek Chisora. There's a lot of differences there, but there's also 1 or 2 similarities. De Mori, being I'm not saying he's going to be shorter than David Haye, because David Haye's also as shorter as the modern heavyweight goes, but being a shorter heavyweight, what he actually does quite well is he tucks up quite nicely and has pretty good head movement and pretty good upper body movement. Sometimes when you see him being punched by an opponent, and admittedly these aren't the best fighters in the world, but he's rolling and leaning quite nicely, and he's able to get low a bit. He's got some sort of basic defensive awareness that often you don't see in fighters outside of the top 100. He sort of tucks up and he's got that sort of upper body movement, which I like in a fighter. In terms of his offense, clearly his record suggests that he's somewhat heavy-handed. Obviously, we'll have to see how that transfers to the upper level of the sport. But he actually throws some really nice body punches. He's got a relatively decent hook to the body, and he throws it with venom, and he throws it as part of combinations. He'll throw hook to the body, uppercut. And against a guy like David Haye, who... I've never been one for saying David Haye's got a dreadful chin or David Haye's got dreadful stamina. But those who detract from David Haye regularly cite those 2 areas as his weaknesses, his chin and his stamina. And if Mark De Mori, this bodybuilder type physique, is going to be coming forward, landing, ripping hooks to his body, that could be a concern. Especially if you're factoring that David Haye's been out of the ring for 3.5 years, and David Haye's style is not necessarily one that would age well. He's got some semblance of a jab, De Mori. I'm not going to say he's got a real good jab compared to like Vladimir Klitschko or one of those names, but he's got a real decent double jab, and he's kind of one of those guys who could potentially, if he can kind of tuck up, weather the David Haye storm a bit, try and roll a bit, and then throw double jab to David Haye's chest, get under his assault and start throwing the hooks to the body, potentially it becomes a more interesting matchup. It's interesting, actually. He's a little bit wild. I've just filmed a video, actually, which was a post-fight video of Derek Chisora's fight against Andres Cosmo. And I actually said very similar things that Chisora needed to do against, like, Robert Helenius in future. That you'd kind of need to get low, you'd need to show lots of head movement, you need to throw the double jab to the chest and then work the body. And I think it's a similar method that Mark De Mori is going to have to adopt in terms of the fight with David Haye. There's going to be a David Haye storm. David Haye's going to probably come out fast. It's a big showing for him. He's going to be coming out. He's going to be throwing a lot of bombs. He's clearly a big puncher. He's known as a very fast-punching, explosive, athletic operator. Clearly there is going to be a bit of a storm for Mark De Mori to weather. But if he can keep that chin down, if he can keep his hands up, and that is an important fact here, because there are some people who know more about Mark De Mori than I do, who say that he can have chin problems. I know he's been stopped in a fight before, and clearly against a guy like David Haye with his punching reputation, he'll want to avoid being tagged early. But if he can weather the storm, and if he can take this fight to the later rounds, perhaps now is the best time to catch David Haye. David Haye has never been a guy to fight at a ferocious pace. I know this is a 10-round fight, but if you look at the fights where Haye actually went 12 in the heavyweight division, Klitschko and Valuev, those weren't fast-paced fights. If you look at the Chisora fight, I know Haye stopped Chisora in the 5th, but a lot of people say that David Haye was really struggling towards the end of that fight and was becoming very, very tired. I just wonder if Haye's sort of very explosive style that suits a younger man, combined with the inactivity, could mean that this is the right time to beat him. Now, I'm not saying Mark De Mori will beat David Haye, don't get me wrong. What I am saying is Mark De Mori has a much better chance of beating David Haye when they fight next week than if David Haye had had 2 or 3 warm-up fights. What I'm getting at is now is definitely the right time to catch him. And I get why Mark De Mori has become a bit of a figure of fun in some circles in the UK boxing community. He's got a truly ridiculous haircut. He's built like a bodybuilder, and he, obviously that makes people think that he's not serious about boxing and he's not got the tools for being a boxer. He's not fought good opposition. He's been stopped before. There are a lot of reasons why people want to ignore Mark De Mori. But having looked at him, I don't think he's as terrible as some people think. Don't get me wrong. Clearly this guy has not and has never and probably doesn't have the capability to ever hit the heights that David Haye once hit when he was beating Nikolai Valuev and putting in great performances against Ruiz and, Enzo Macronelli and John Mark Mormack and all of those names. He's not got the same upside as David Haye. But the question remains, is David Haye still David Haye? And I think that is quite a poignant question. I met David Haye recently when I was at the Joshua White weigh-in. And the guy was huge compared to what he used to look like. Huge, really, you could just see it in him, how thick he was. I don't know how much David Haye's weighing at the minute, but I'm anticipating it's going to be 15.5, 16 stone. What I'm getting at is you've got a guy who's 3.5 years older, a couple of, a good sort of 10, 15, 20 pounds heavier, with a style that suits a young, explosive speedster. I just don't know. I don't think this fight is as open as shut as it can be. Clearly David Haye's got power. Power's the last thing to go. And maybe Mark De Mori doesn't have a world-class chin. It could be as simple as David Haye goes out, taps him in the first and stops him. But I'm not convinced this is going to be as easy work as some people think it is. I'm going to do a bit more looking into Mark De Mori. I'll do a finalised prediction video at some point in the week. But just wanted to get some thoughts out there, having sat down and watched Mark De Mori for the first time. Let me know your thoughts on this fight. Have I overestimated Mark De Mori, or do you see something in him as well? Many thanks for watching.